Hi everyone, I hope you're all keeping well. Welcome to this webinar, Changing Mindsets in the Manufacturing Sector. My name is Loïc Lemarois. I'm a Senior Marketing Manager at Headspring and I'll be your host today. This webinar is intended to be interactive. The main point is we want to hear from you. So please do send in your comments, your questions by using the Q&A, which should be on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll make sure to reply most of the questions during the session as soon as they arrive. Otherwise, we'll have 10 minutes of Q&A at the end. So without further delay, I would like to introduce you to Mirjam Baijens, who is the Global Head of Talent and Development at Schindler. Today we also have Daniel Thomas, who is the Chief UK Business Correspondent at the Financial Times. Hi Mirjam, hi Daniel, I'm glad you could join us today. So nice to see you.
Hi.
Good morning.
So Daniel, I'll let you start with the floor.
Sure, okay, well, thank you so much for the introduction. Yeah, hi everyone, I'm the Chief Business Correspondent at the FT, been at the paper for 15 years or so in many different guises, but now cover a broad policy and business brief, and as part of that I do cover the manufacturing industry, especially in the UK, but more broadly as well, and some of the big global trends. So thank you, first of all, so much for having me. This will be broadly structured as a two-parter event where I chat for a bit about what we're seeing at the FT, and then rely on the more intelligent insight from my esteemed colleague at Schindler. So just to kick off, it's worth pointing out that as with many industries, COVID has upended how manufacturing works. It has tested and disrupted supply chains, but also speeded up the pace of change that would otherwise have taken many years. I've lost count of the many executives have told me how COVID has been the worst of times for many in the world, but the best of times for corporate strategy and technological change. Never waste a good crisis, as they say, and the strength of manufacturers to power out of the pandemic is really something to behold. There are record numbers, as you might expect, in the pharma industry, as shown by Pfizer and GSK yesterday and AstraZeneca today, but pretty much across the board, this has been a great time to be making things. There are probably a few dozen companies reporting across the FTSE 350 and across the Euronext today, and if you look through the numbers, they're all almost broadly consistently good. Companies are doing well and they're coming out of this pandemic in good health, and these are things that we should really be very confident about, because ultimately companies are doing well, they're powering through. It shows the markets and the consumer markets are doing broadly okay too. Governments are really taking note of this, I think, as well, adapting industrial policy to bring manufacturing closer to their shores once more. But before I talk more on that, I want to have a quick word on the backdrop. First of all, let's think about these things that manufacturers can't really control, which is a really interesting period for the global economy, where developing nations will look to bounce back strongly. But developed nations, I should say, we're really looking to bounce back strongly. The UK, many of the European countries, the US, and so on. But developing nations are falling behind to some degree, in part split by the success of respective vaccine programs. There are, of course, headwinds here. We don't know the progress of the next stage of the pandemic, and we are likely to enter a period of stealth austerity where the government tries to rein things in and raise taxes while pretending not to. The consequence on public borrowing here from saving the economy, in effect, is a rise to almost a fifth of national income in the UK alone. And of course, this will need to be covered. There is a long road to go, and the government's already flagging tax rises here, certainly. But nonetheless, the economic outlook is getting much better, and we could be back to pre-pandemic levels of growth by the end of the year in the UK, the Eurozone, and into the US and UK, particularly the outliers here, according to the IMF. And this does seem remarkable to where we were 18 months ago. In the first lockdown last year, manufacturers faced one of their biggest immediate losses in the form of sales and orders due to a combination of falling demand for goods and services, as well as supply chain issues preventing the delivery of key components of production. But somewhat surprisingly, given the panic of the first 6 weeks, demand held up in many areas. Most factories continue to run through the year, even if sometimes they need to be pivoted to the COVID economy of PPE and masks and so on. Many big manufacturers thus enjoyed a very decent year, albeit sometimes where supply chains were heavily impacted and demand skewed to pandemic needs. For others, pandemic lockdowns and government stimulus have actually fueled their demand, the consumer demand particularly, Every time a furlough check has landed, consumer manufacturers report a spike in demand for trainers, TVs, furniture, and so on. In the UK, the bounce back loan scheme has reportedly bought any number of new Ferraris. Again, for most companies, supply chain flexibility and response has performed reasonably well through this complete shift in demand profile, even sometimes with massive mid-course resets of production and delivery plans to accommodate that demand volatility. So the agility and real-time decision-making through this period has been crucial and really aided by the technology that has allowed these rapid changes to production and supplies. Indeed, ensuring this agility is enshrined in operations has now become a key concern for management going forward. All the executives I speak to plan to invest heavily in supply chain resilience and the diversity going forward. It's not, of course, all good. For others focused on aerospace and aviation, it's been much more of a struggle. Demand remains low, factory shuttered, shareholders continuing to supply cash to get them through the period. This is likely to be the case for some time to come, given normal conditions on travelling are particularly sort of distant, it feels at the moment. But nonetheless, this is one of the smaller areas to really worry about. And supply chain, I think, is also still an issue. The Suez Canal clearly showed how fragile supply chains can be and how dependent we are on certain routes. The backlog caused by the blockage of the Suez Canal caused these huge hold-ups in essential supplies, and even for empty containers, with factories running at full steam but struggling to find space for their finished goods. I think the other interesting element of the supply chain has been the electronics and electrical equipment subsectors, which have been a major contributor to the share of firms, indicating a worsening of sales and orders in recent months as a result of a significant shortage of chips, the semiconductor chips, that has caused supply chain issues for many. So the makers of cars, smartphones, PCs, tablets, TVs have, basically have shown this interesting sort of the mismatch of supply and demand. They underestimated expectations of demand during the pandemic and then rapidly ramped up orders that caught the chip manufacturers unprepared and unsupplied. Again, these have led to a limited availability of key manufacturers around the world, and these disruptions again cause these cost increases and delays for numerous industries. In fact, globally, there's been recent price pressures for many parts of the industry, reflecting these unusual pandemic-related developments and supply-demand mismatches. The IMF this week said that inflation should return to pre-pandemic ranges in most countries in 2022 after seeing this relative burst of inflation. But for anyone who has tried to build an extension or loft conversion of their home, and I among them, the price of raw materials and supplies remains staggeringly high. Changing factor costs could favour reshoring or nearshoring production for some components, while regionalisation of supply chains has been underway for some time. There is a slight dilemma here, though, as with the desire to reduce complexity, supply chains can become less flexible, and when the future will really require much more dynamic and responsive supply networks to keep pace with change and remain resilient. Supply chain disruptions have also highlighted the importance of another differentiating factor, which is the use of technology. And this is something I've written a lot about and speak pretty much daily with executives on about the importance of this coming through. The pandemic has sparked a once-in-a-generation change in society and the economy, how we work and live and shop and eat and communicate, even do these round tables and conferences. This is all fundamentally changed. Manufacturing is no different, and technology is really at the heart of a lot of these shifts. So the pandemic has been a catalyst to accelerate the trends that are in motion over the past 2 decades, especially regarding digital transformation and source diversification. Digitalization and risk management capabilities have become a key part of the strategic agenda and operational resilience, which is why, while the pandemic has brought economies to their knees and healthcare systems to the brink of collapse, again, the ability for the well-placed tech-enabled manufacturer to power through and often profit has been undented. Digitalization is revolutionizing modern manufacturing and has without doubt kept it running successfully over the past year. The rewards are obvious, technological leaps in the design, development, fabrication, operation of goods and services. We know all this stuff is coming through. You can see it, you can feel it. It's really making an impact now in a way that perhaps 10, 15 years ago, many companies were struggling to comprehend. Automation has already transformed how many manufacturers work, of course, but now they are seeking to use more advanced technology, often involving AI and data science, to model production and ensure efficiency. Manufacturers are already reporting a phenomenal impact when applied to certain specific areas. Data scientists are now as much in demand as engineers in many manufacturing plants, as companies seek to take advantage of this vast amount of data they get from their processes, the millions of data points, and actually make them into workable solutions. Simply put, there are not enough software engineers versus hardware engineers now. Executives say that the one big obstacle for tech progress is being able to turn this raw data into operational plans, and for that you need skilled database and big data programmers. But the results are in many cases, like I say, are staggering. I was talking to one executive last month who said he quickly found out that he had a lot of data, but it wasn't usable in its current state. Unlike the existing high-level management reports he was used to, digital solutions tapped into nearly all the data collected on the shop floor. However, only the high-level data was fully reliable, so his learning was that all teams needed to take responsibility for data accuracy. Part of the problem of poor data quality is the technological debt of legacy systems, of course, which have effectively held back some companies. And so change management skills are important, as well as those that can break down the silos across teams, across operations, and reduce fragmentation. And again, we'll talk about this later, the interesting thing about the pandemic has really been this lowering or breaking of silos, lowering of barriers between stratas of management to really allow workers access to management in the way they haven't been before. The other key area for technology, and this relates to that, I think, is remote monitoring, production, and working, which again has posed problems that many have managed to overcome, from head offices working from home or using video conferencing to sensor tech to help the factory floor. One of the main issues here has become cyber defense, cyber security to some degree. Office staff were sent home with a newly bought laptop and little proper security as they work from kitchen tables, which caused all sorts of issues for the CISOs of the world. And so cyber security has really ramped up the boardroom agenda, with so many having to deal with these new issues, new problems. And part of this, again, is the supply chain to ensure that your customers and suppliers also can demonstrate or guarantee the robustness of their own cybersecurity. So these skills in IT and cyber are so much more sought after than they were perhaps 3 or 4 years ago. Although schools, from what I hear, are broadly still a big issue for the industry, and recruitment can be a challenge for the right positions and right entry-level ages. The other big area I write a lot about is ESG. And this in the UK particularly has become a major focus for regulators and for the government to really force change. Manufacturers, I think, are now see the environmental, social, and governance programs, the ESG programs, as necessary to maintain both a competitive advantage as well as deal with these regulatory pressures. But many are still working out quite how to go about it. It obviously needs to come from the top, establish targets and commitments to pursue ESG-minded best practices and initiatives. That includes automotive manufacturers, for example, pledging to go green. Some of the big German manufacturers you're seeing coming already sort of paying a degree of lip service and indeed practical steps towards doing this. And here again, technology and data is crucial for performance monitoring and reporting. But if they don't act, then regulatory pressures, like I say, will make them, as well as the staff and shareholder pressure on being a good steward going forward. This includes worker safety and well-being, what progress a company is making on diversity, equality and inclusion, DEI, whether executive compensation is linked to ESG goals and so on. ESG investing, the shareholder pressure is also clearly going to be a major force to change behaviours going forward as well. In staffing terms, companies have often struggled to find the right people again. Often the investor relations or general counsel take the lead on ESG. Sometimes it's the CFO or CMO, while others have chief sustainability officers or vice presidents or directors for sustainability or both. Again, this feels like a big focus going forward to try and get the structures right to make sure this is embedded and in place across the operation. So that was my quick overview about what I'm seeing, what I'm hearing, doing roundtables with executives from various manufacturers, and some of the broader trends that people are saying and talking about within manufacturing. But I think they're really, despite the fact that I've highlighted some issues around supply chain, around cyber and so on, around skill shortages, the news is really very much positive compared to what it was 6 months ago, 12 months ago, certainly 18 months ago. And the political will is really towards encouraging their nations to once again specialize in making things and making them cleanly and efficiently, and with a nod at least towards ESG and towards societal pressures. So to me, it's clear that the future will require strong leadership, a clear vision, and a willing workforce. with people, as always, more important than any real technological innovation. Companies are having to be much more mindful now, I think, of what their workers want as they return from the pandemic. The power structures and the emphasis about what's important for many workers, I think, has changed in the last 18 months. And that has been really reflected in new policies around HR and around ways of working that will really become a fascinating case study of how change can happen going forward. So some of the big questions I'm hearing from global CEOs include, how do we break down silos across business units and geographies? How do you obtain employee buy-in and support for digitization? And how do we make it stick? How do you drive the adoption of these new ways of working that embed digital solutions, overcoming these, these natural reticence around, I don't get it, I don't have the time, or I don't need it, and ensuring that your staff are fully motivated, engaged, and productive, even if working remotely or working in a hybrid environment. So that's probably enough of me talking, and so I really want to bring in my esteemed fellow speaker, Mirjam, to really address some of these points, to talk through what her company has managed to achieve, what Schindler has seen, and what Schindler has really sort of learned from the pandemic going forward. So, I mean, if I can now come to you, I've just literally rattled through about sort of 24 different points of things which are reflecting the pandemic and how that's impacting the manufacturing industry globally, but particularly in Europe and especially in the UK, which is my specialism. So I think what would be great is if first of all we could hear from you about your story, about your journey for the last 18 months, about what you saw, where you were at the beginning of the pandemic, and what your initial kind of initial thoughts were, initial sort of operational issues and challenges were, and how you managed to come through those, and then we can go from there, perhaps.
Sure. No, thank you, Dan. So I think what we saw, like many other companies at the beginning of the pandemic, was first and foremost, we focused on the safety of our employees, because we have 30,000 people who operate in the field. So these are installers or service engineers. They take care of maintenance. And in most countries, even at the beginning of the pandemic, support for elevators and escalators was marked as an essential service, because you can imagine if you're in a hospital and if the elevator is not working, you do have a problem. So that was, on the one hand, a good thing, because a lot of our people could continue working, at least at the service and maintenance activities. At the same time, we had to make sure that they were protected. And I'm sure we all remember at the beginning of the pandemic, no one was quite sure what this disease was going to do. So we focused heavily on sourcing PPE, personal protective equipment for all our employees, masks, hazmat suits, gloves, you name it. And this is where, for me, that was a very good example in Schindler, where our internal purchasing organization just sourced wherever they could find it around the world, and then just shipped it to the countries where they needed it most. So that throughout the whole pandemic, we were always able to provide our employees with enough materials to protect them. And I think that was very important also from a people point of view, plus the fact that we could continue a lot of the activities. Of course, at the beginning, like a lot of construction sites were closed. So those type of activities came to a complete halt. That picked up again later during the course of the last year and a half. But what we also saw was, from our supply chain perspective, because we have a big factory in China, in India, in the US, we also had to be creative in terms of sourcing our materials. I think the positive thing was that we had no major bottlenecks. Of course, we had some challenging moments, but because we were able to use the different locations around the world, there was not a major shortage. And by the time China was back to normal, we were still in the midst of it here in Europe, or still are. But of course, that helped us to keep the supply chain going. Later on, some of our factories actually started producing face masks or face shields, had to use the facilities. And as part of what you mentioned earlier, as part of our ESG approach or CSR approach, we also made a point that whatever we produced, we also donated at least 10% to the local communities. So we donated that to local hospitals or care institutions. And even when we were purchasing things, so not yet producing ourselves, we made sure that in every country we also donated to especially healthcare institutions. As of today, we still produce masks in China and we ship them around where we can, the simple surgical masks. We use them internally, but we also still donate part of it, and we also provide it to other organizations. So I think we've seen some very good examples of where people reacted very quickly, where we were agile enough, even though it took everyone by surprise. The biggest learning, which was also based on a survey we did last year, sort of around May, June timeframe. Actually, no, it was earlier. It was May. We did an internal survey with all the people who were part of our internal crisis management teams. Because when it sort of hit Europe back in February 2020, we immediately rolled out a structure that we had a global crisis management team, of which I was also part of. And the same structure was set up at country level and at geographical zone level. So we cascaded that structure to be very quick to share best practices. Because in one country where nothing was happening yet, we could at least inform them, what do you do on day one? What do you need to prepare? What are things to be mindful of? We did an internal survey of the experience so far, and I think everyone came to the conclusion we could have been better prepared based on what we already experienced with our site in China. But I think a lot of companies went through the same learning curve, and everyone thought, well, it's not going to come anywhere else, which it did. But that structure is still in place today and still works very well because we share best practices from one country with the other, or if there is something where we can say, this is what we need to leverage globally, we coordinate that, I'm part of that, and then we redistribute. So that mechanism is still in place today, even though in a lot of countries we are now slowly returning back to the next normal, so to speak.
Yeah, so did you feel sort of closer as a company then? Obviously this sort of overlay of a global, as you say, response must have brought teams that you hadn't dealt with before closer together, and people you perhaps didn't necessarily know existed, like a few weeks beforehand. You were having to work very closely with, I guess.
Exactly. We actually improved the cross collaboration, even though everything was remote and virtually and no travel whatsoever. We still actually have a travel ban unless it's essential for customers or essential for the business to keep the business going. But it made it better in terms of alignment, because we also realized when you have all these video calls, it's much more, you have 10 minutes, then you have the next one, you have an hour, so you power through it. And it did actually bring some organizations close together, funnily enough. Not meeting in person, but collaborating virtually. Yeah.
And did you find you had all the right technology there in place, the sort of I don't know, Microsoft Teams or whatever it might be, to do this? Because I found that suddenly, having never used video conferencing before, as now an expert. We were actually laughing earlier, weren't we, that I was on mute at the beginning. Not quite an expert, getting there.
Yeah. No, we had already MS Teams established. However, we faced definitely bandwidth issues at the beginning when suddenly everyone was homebound. I must say our IT organization did a fantastic job to upgrade this very quickly, and we keep on adding new features to it. But at the beginning, for sure, there was an issue with bandwidth and connectivity, because it went from one day to the next. We also launched already right before COVID an internal chat channel, which is Yammer, which is one of these tools. And the plan was to roll this out gradually to the 60,000 plus employees. But they basically made this happen very quickly. within the time span of 2 weeks, everyone was suddenly on there, and that helped a lot as well to communicate internally. We had at the beginning our CEO posting regular messages, little videos on this internal chat channel, which created a lot of engagement, and especially our consistent message that the first priority was the safety of our employees, the second priority was the continuation of the operations, and the third priority were the financials. In other words, yes, of course, the numbers were still important, but the people and the continuation of the business also for our customers were higher up in the ranks. So they ramped up very quickly from an IT point of view. We prepared very quickly how to work from home toolkits, e-learnings, guidelines, because Schindler was not used to that, for sure. It was not a company like the IT sector or telecom where people were already more used to that. So we ramped that up very quickly. We did regular pulse checks with people, like how is it working from home? What can we do more? And some countries also used this downtime for the people in the field who could not go to customers or not to external meetings to boost their training and roll out e-learnings. For example, I know that in India, they provided to all our salespeople like daily or every other day, like specific e-learnings for them, because they said, well, you can't go and see the customer, at least you can work on your own education. We had no global home office guideline. So we developed a global remote working guideline, which was established in May last year, and then we rolled it out to all the countries so that they could incorporate it in their local HR policies. And what I find very positive is we want to keep that. We want to keep that flexibility. Of course, it varies a bit country per country because you have different legislation. So they can adjust based on those local requirements, but we want to keep that flexibility on purpose because we've seen that it will also help attract different people to the company. And it will help us in our endeavor to create a more diverse workforce. If you provide that flexibility, you can attract different people as opposed to having to be in the office every day. Now, of course, our field workers were already used to working very independently, remotely, because they are daily somewhere on site, and they work already remotely, independently for many years. But of course, it was a very big shift for the office-based staff. Now, at the same time, with the field workers, we needed to make sure that we stayed connected with them. So a lot of the line managers or service leaders made sure to connect with all their team members on a daily basis, especially at the beginning. How are you? 5-minute call, what's happening? To keep that connection between people.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing. It was often about keeping that connection, wasn't it? I mean, just as a sort of just to frame this a little bit as well. I mean, where are you on the remote working policy? Are you instigating a hybrid working structure going forward? What is the? And I realise there is obviously local HR policy to be taken into account, but broadly from the top, what do you envisage going forward?
We haven't. We actually have a workshop in the next few weeks again with our executive team. However, the hybrid model for sure will be the model moving forward. It will vary a bit per country. Maybe in some countries they say, okay, it needs to be a minimum of 2-3 days in the office and align with your line manager, so they have that flexibility. But we want to keep that hybrid model. So that also forces us to rethink what is the purpose of the office. It becomes much more a place to connect, to network, for certain meetings, whereas some work is maybe better done from home. At the same time, we have people, depending on their local circumstances, who are very happy to be back in the office, full time. So we leave that flexibility. And so that hybrid model will be that model moving forward. But then, of course, you have to be mindful of how do you keep the engagement going with all team members. If some people are not as often in the same location as others, do they feel disconnected? Do they feel not part of a discussion? So those are the topics that we're working on as we speak, how to keep that sense of belonging going.
Yeah. I think that is one of the issues, isn't it? Cultural identity and how you, if people aren't in the office, because there is something good about the office because it keeps people sort of focused on the fact that they're working for a company, if nothing else. And that is an issue, isn't it? I mean, have you thought about how to come up with any sort of solutions to that yet? I mean, where do you think that's going to go? Because I see it all the time with different people. You can feel them, some people drifting away, and that's, you know, and that's exactly what you don't want to do. But at the same time, it's very difficult when they're sitting hundreds of miles away, aren't they?
Yeah. I mean, what we are going to establish is also, we do, for example, every 2 years a global engagement survey. That is already an established mechanism for more than 10 years now. However, we are now going to establish a more, what we call sort of listening strategy as part of that whole overall engagement approach. So in other words, try to connect with employees on a more regular basis for specific areas of change or specific topics, do quick pulse surveys, do a bit of a temperature check. So that's one of the mechanisms that we're designing as we speak, like what could this listening engagement strategy look like for the future to stay closer connected so that you can flag issues faster. And secondly, it's also supporting line managers with, you know, how do you lead remotely? Again, we've already provided some development support and some, we call it development toolkits. You know, they have been made available. I feel personally that is an area where we have to continue to focus on, and also for employees themselves. So another area as part of the whole next normal approach is to continue to strengthen our focus on employee well-being. We have a very strong focus on safety. That's already, you know, that's been part of our culture for as long as as long as this company has been around. But if you take a broader approach, you know, the health and well-being is also essential, and we've seen that during COVID. A lot of our countries have taken a lot of local activities or have implemented a lot of local activities already around, it ranges from support, helplines for employees, whether it's mental support, financial support, all related to COVID. And we said we actually have to take all these good things that came out of that and combine it in a broader employee well-being approach. So this covers, of course, the next normal, the hybrid way of working, but also social well-being, financial well-being, mental well-being, and how do you keep that sense of belonging? So that is exactly what we're working on as we speak. Don't have all the answers yet, but we have that on the top of our list because keeping that culture alive and keeping that connection alive is essential.
So yeah, it's so important for companies. I think it's and it's interesting how remote or hybrid working can be inclusive in the sense of, you know, if you're a parent, you can look after children, you can whatever, or dependents. But at the same time, it can be excluding as well because you're not necessarily in the office, you're not in the meeting room where perhaps decisions are made. And I think there's that tension there, isn't there, between, but I honestly don't know how it's going to work out because some of those things are really difficult to deal with. Yeah,
and what we've always done, I mean, this company has been around for more than 145 years, and this sense of you know, community and also this family focus is still a critical part of our values. So when we think of designing these approaches, we also think of the broader stakeholders behind it. So how can we help our employees and as a result their families or the communities that we operate in had to also be and remain an employer of choice. And that, of course, how you now react and provide ways of working in this next normal, as we call it, continues to be essential also as part of your well, good employership.
Yeah, yeah. And so I should for the people who are watching, you operate across 140 different countries. Is that about right? I read that somewhere, so I'm hoping it's right.
Yeah, no, that's true.
That's true. So I mean, and how do you? I mean, you sort of touched on this before, but how do you adapt across that many different countries? Because everywhere is a bit different. And during COVID, everyone, as you say, was in a slightly different part of that journey, as it were. Some coming in, some going out. So it's very difficult to have a single policy, isn't it? And how much authority and autonomy do you give to local areas to do their own thing?
The countries have a lot of autonomy. I mean, I think that is a strong element of the the business model in Schindler. Is we are not a typical sort of top-down driven company. There is good level of autonomy at country level. And very often, of course, there are some things that need to be consistent globally, like in every company. However, the key approach is that you look at, okay, what is a useful framework for whatever topic it is, and then countries do have the flexibility to adjust that. Of course, like I said, there are mechanisms around performance management or the way we report financially. Of course, that is consistent all around the world. But especially when you look at people-related activities or learning and development-related activities, we work very closely together. We work very closely together with the countries in this model, what we call co-creation. So we take the input based on what they need. We try to develop something, we develop something then based on the needs of the different local countries to come up with a program or a framework. And then there is a healthy level of flexibility to roll it out. So in that sense, we continue to be very mindful of the different requirements. At the same time, of course, there are also elements, especially when you look at HR, where you need to be consistent in the way we use our HR systems and we use our compensation and benefits approach. But there is a good level of autonomy at country level.
Yeah, yeah. And I thought it was interesting what you were saying about the CEO doing, personalized messages, every week. And I remember talking to people at BP in the C-suite at BP who were saying, their CEO Looney would often do, weekly calls with basically the entire company, globally, for anyone who wants to join him to do so, which I thought was, a remarkable level of access, which was probably never before available to many junior workers across BP, vast oil company around the world. And suddenly they could sort of see and even talk to their CEO on a regular basis, which I thought was a really interesting sort of example of how managements were becoming a lot more kind of closer to their workers, and perhaps management structures were becoming slightly flatter. I mean, and obviously you've got a part of this within your company as well. Do you see this as a permanent shift, that workers want to feel like they can see and hear from managements a lot more regularly than perhaps they were before? I'm not saying you weren't doing it before, but do you think there is actually about how workers approach the company?
Yeah, I think it does. And I think it also has shown the need to strengthen our internal communications, to really let people know what is happening, what measures are we taking, where are we going, and use different channels of communications throughout the organization. This level of communication was not there before, and I think that is a positive shift because employees also expect it. And then, of course, also, the different country managers or the geographical leaders have taken a lot of actions there, because in a crisis like this, you need to communicate, you need to be informing people and create different platforms that they can also come to you with their questions. So what we also now do, we actually had it last week as well, the quarterly results. When there is now a broadcast, we do that also fully online now. And basically anyone from the globe can join in or can submit questions via chat. which are then being shared in a live discussion. And if they cannot be answered in the live discussion, they're being answered online. So I think the technology has definitely created a different way of interaction in Schindler, which we didn't have before, in a positive way.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting how that's going to, if it's going to be kept and made a permanent feature going forward for all companies. Obviously, you guys are already thinking about that sort of thing. In terms of like things like skills and development and training. Well, first of all, obviously, pandemic-wise, how are you kind of coming through the next stages of that? But are you now seeing that there's more difficulty in finding the right employees? Are skills becoming scarcer, as it were, across the countries and sectors you work with?
Well, the example that you gave in your introduction, finding the right software engineers as part of our whole digitization is also a challenge for us. So for sure, that is also about finding the right people and then keeping them. In terms of our learning and development strategy, the pandemic actually has had a very positive impact that we've gone completely virtual. We were, especially in terms of non-technical development, we were quite old school, meaning classroom training, and you have a 3-day session, and then there's maybe some follow-up, but that's it. We've gone completely virtual, and turning it also into more what we call learning journeys. So instead of having a one-off event, you now have an interaction through the course of 7 months, but shorter interactions, whether it's live sessions, whether it's self-paced e-learning, whether it's interactions with your peers. So it's sort of digestible chunks of learning that are spread across a longer period of time, which, especially when you talk about skills or behavioral development, of course, reinforces that much better than a one-off session. And I think in the beginning, some people were skeptical whether that would work or not. However, the feedback has been extremely positive. And that for sure in the future, I would expect maybe a bit more of a combination again of some face-to-face and some virtual. But we've now seen that the effects of virtual training are even better than what we did face-to-face. We've also organized short sort of networking, call it a sort of lunch and learn type of sessions, but like interesting topic, interesting speaker, 2-hour sessions for our senior leaders to connect with each other. And to what you mentioned before, they talk to peers like country managers that they've never spoken to before. So it has actually strengthened the interaction. And for sure, in our learning and development strategy, it's something that we will continue to do, and has enabled us to increase the reach significantly.
Yeah, I think, again, just from my own point of view, personal point of view, you just see that being much more of a focus, particularly as people, as you say, become much more difficult to get into skilled roles. One interesting element I was talking to someone about the other day is the feeling that after things subside in the pandemic, there might be a little bit more of a churn in their workforce as well. People, suddenly thinking about the next steps, next career steps, potentially outside the company. Is that something you're mindful of, going forward? That people are thinking that we've had 2 years basically in our homes. Maybe we want a career change, maybe we want a company change. How do you adapt to that as a big company with, as you say, 60,000 employees or so?
We already see in some countries higher turnover rates, which on the one hand is not unhealthy, because some countries actually had a very low turnover rate. And sometimes you do need a bit of a healthy change level. But of course, we see that as well. We're very mindful of that. So we are investigating root causes there, and hence want to strengthen that engagement approach with our employees. Because there are indeed maybe people who also rethink their career, or who have been in the situation that due to family circumstances, things have changed. I would expect that the retention focus is something that we have to continue to see as a priority moving forward, because in some areas you already see an increased churn.
Yeah, I was thinking, I was talking to someone about the management level as well, and the prospect of of managers who have had a very stressful 2 years, almost needing a break or needing something else just because they've gone through this whole period of trying to keep operations running, and suddenly the treadmill kind of not ends but slows down, and they just sort of start wondering what next. And psychologically, you can see that in action, can't you, I suppose?
Yeah, and that is part, as what I just mentioned, this whole employee well-being approach as well, that we really look at these 4 pillars, whether it's social, mental, physical, or financial well-being. For example, in the Middle East, they've already rolled out a specific program, but also in South America, Brazil, we have many countries who have rolled out local programs to be mindful of the fact that this has been an extremely stressful period for everyone in whichever shape or form. And we want to go beyond just, focusing on the physical safety, which remains a key priority. But all those other aspects have become critical and will continue to be critical. So I think in my view, but okay, that's my personal view, I think this is something that will not go away and that we need to continue to focus on as an organization for the foreseeable future, because you're right, we will still get a sort of after effect if eventually the world is running in this whatever next normal it is. You will see an effect. And you have to be prepared like that for that as a company.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Just a reminder to our watchers, we are taking questions now, effectively. So please, we've got 10 minutes left of the session before we wrap up. So please do send over some questions to either of us, and we'll do our best to answer them. The question and answer box should be visible to you. If not, do let us know. Do send a message through on that basis as well. But send questions in, and we'll attempt to address them in the best way we can. But just to continue with a few more from me, but while we wait. So just thinking about the position of a company in society, because I think that's the other interesting area from what I'm hearing about how, and this is partly spurred by what workers want to see from their companies as well. But do you think the sort of corporate's role in the world is slightly changing now? There's a slight, and it comes to the ESG question, I suppose.
Yeah. No, it is, and we are very mindful of that through all our efforts, whether it's around sustainability, whether it's, of course, the environmental focus there, but also the corporate social responsibility. We have that role as an organization as well, especially when you're a large organization. And with everything happening in the world today, that continues to be essential. And I think that is essential part of the philosophy of Schindler as well. How we also went through this pandemic saying, yes, of course, the financials remain critical and important, because otherwise you cannot be sustainable as an organization. We do focus on all these other priorities as well. And if I look at the future challenges, like I said, last Friday, our Q2 results were presented. We are, of course, also faced with increasing prices of raw materials, with increasing challenges around sourcing, challenges around finding the right skilled people and retaining them. And more people who are probably wondering, okay, what is my sense of purpose, and where do I want to work, and why do I want to work there? So all those elements, whether it's purely the financial impact, but then also the people impact, needs to be embedded in that whole ESG approach, which is what we are driving. Of course, a lot of it is still unknown. I think everyone is, as you mentioned, looking for the answers right now. At the same time, we'll continue on that path of having that focus that we've had for years.
How do you structure internally? Do you have someone who sort of sits above an ESG or CSR agenda and sort of cascades it down, or I mean, do you split it up? How do you sort of go about managing these different things? And
yeah,
a lot
so
of
we have a global head of sustainability, which is part of our corporate organization. We also have published, of course, our sustainability report, and we have that closely linked to CSR activities. Some of these things are happening globally. Some of it is, again, the same principle where it's cascaded, or we take best practices from countries and share them across. But it is definitely part of our top executive agenda, and we have a responsible organization for that.
Yeah, yeah. And of the three sort of pillars of ESG, environment, society, and governance, I mean, what is a priority for you, or do you sort of treat them all sort of equally, as it were? Because it feels like the environment, particularly, is getting a lot of focus here with COP26 coming through.
I mean, the environment is getting a lot of focus, of course, also given the type of industry we're in, that we have to look at all our, whether it's CO2 emissions to, you know, all the usual suspects as part of the environmental focus. We have factories, so we have to be mindful of those environmental aspects. At the same time, the other two areas receive equally amount of focus. You know, if you look at our role as a responsible employer, we're looking at areas from equal pay to diversity and inclusion to, you know, everything that relates to that side, and how that reflects your role as an employer in the communities you're part of. Like I said, COVID was again a very good example where we said, whatever we do in purchase, we donate to our communities, and we continue to do that as part of the broader responsibility that we have. We had, or we still have, you know, our factory workers in India who could not go home and had to, you know, we had to create facilities for them at the factory. We provided also to the families and the children who could not go to school and therefore not have their midday meal. They were offered meals through the company. So I think this is an essential part of our culture, that we look beyond purely the basics in that sense.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think again, that role of the corporate and society, again, is sort of a fascinating sort of you know, example of how things have been changing, I think, in the next period after the pandemic. But which reminder, any questions coming, do send them through. Otherwise, I'm going to wrap up with just a broader question for you, if that's possible. So, I mean, if you're looking across the sort of opportunities, but also the challenges for both Schindler, but also the broader manufacturing base. I mean, if you were to focus on, I don't know, one or two big opportunities, what would you say they were, and what are the big challenges that you're worried about going forward?
Well, I think the opportunities are that, you know, the urbanization, even though through COVID, we've seen also a shift that people want to move out of urban areas and want to have more space and want to be closer to nature and need an extra room because they have a home office now, that you see a bit of a shift. Urbanization will continue, and also that you know, connection in terms of the mobility of people, you know, that's also part of our strategy. We move people around the world, you know, we say it's 1 billion people that we move every day in whichever shape or form, you know, whether it's escalators, elevators, or moving belt. That trend will continue. So that is of course where the growth is. At the same time, the challenges, I think, are around also having the right skills, being fast enough in terms of the digitization, being agile enough as an organization to adapt. On the one hand, we have a tremendously rich history as an organization. At the same time, we now also need to sometimes be more agile, which is a big focus area moving forward. So it's a combination of those challenges that I see, but at the same time, the opportunities in the market and the opportunities as an industry are definitely there, what you also explained in your introduction.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating period ahead of us, and I think you're not alone in needing and seeking that agility to adapt to changes as they come up. And it's been a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today, and it's been a delight. And with that, I'll hand over to our organisers at Headspring to take it away.
Yeah, thank you. Unfortunately, we didn't really have any questions because I think it was really interesting. So I think we'll wrap up for today. Mirjam, Daniel, thank you very much for joining the session. It was very interesting. I hope as well the people that joined today found it very useful. So yeah, I'd like to thank you for joining. And Mirjam, Daniel, again, thank you very much for joining today. Hope we can collaborate again on a Headspring webinar. For the rest, I wish you all a really good day. Please stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next Headspring webinar. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.